Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Reading Culture and back to our discussion of Beowulf. So, when we last left off, we were looking at the defeat of Grendel by Beowulf. The first monster fight has been concluded in favor of the hero, and now we are going to see results from that. And I think perhaps what results from that may be a bit surprising. So as we start off here, we see around line 846 or so that he's crawled off, right? He's fatally wounded. We don't actually see him die. He's had his arm ripped off, but we see here that he was put to flight and left a fatal trail. Right? So he's been taken care of in that way. And you see right after that, right, that it says that uh, terrible swirling waves, all mingled together with hot gore, heaved with the blood of battle, concealed that doomed one. When, deprived of joys, he laid down his life in his lair in the fen. His heathen soul and hell took him. Right, so we get this sense that he crawled back to his mere, right, his uh, lair in the fen, as it's put, and expired. Right, but we also get this description here of him as the doomed one, right? So that we have a sense that it was, in this case at least, it was Beowulf. It was not Beowulf; it was Grendel who was doomed to die. Um, we're going to see throughout this repeated idea of weird or fate, and right how some people are doomed to die and others aren't, and that affects the outcome of battles and things of this nature. So we see that functioning here. We also, of course, get these explicit references to right his heathen soul and hell taking him. So again, these are comments of the author or the narrator, we could say, but not of Beowulf himself, because that would be anachronistic. And the result of this victory by Beowulf is actually another tale, right? So if we look at lines 867, uh, kind of continuing along, say 874 or so, maybe, we get a sense of this coming story. It says, at times the king's thane, full of grand stories, mindful of songs, remembered much, a great many of the old tales, found other words truly bound together. He began again to recite with skill the adventure of Beowulf, adeptly tell an apt tale and weave his words. Right, so which is kind of interesting. This we get a sense here of the role of heroic tales within this tale of heroism itself, within the culture. So it's particularly interesting if we can imagine the possible uh, cultural context for this poem, which would be right an Anglo-Saxon mead hall, perhaps a bunch of warriors gathered around it, right around the hearth with a shop, a poet, a bard, maybe you could say, um, reciting the tale of Beowulf, and then within the tale of Beowulf itself, this great tale of heroism, we are now going to get another tale of heroism within that. So it says that uh, the King's Thane starts off by he's putting Beowulf's tale into song, which is interesting enough. But then he's going to tell another story. We're going to get here now a story within a story right after this. Right? It says he told nearly all that he had heard said of Siamund's stirring deeds. Now here we get a fairly long note in this edition by Professor Liuzzo, but it's really worth reading because if you don't know who Siamund is, you'll want to know. And Dr. Liuzzo says this: Beowulf is praised indirectly by being compared first to Siamund, another famous monster slayer, a different version of whose story is told in the Old Norse Volundsa Saga and the Middle High German Nibelungenlied. There, the dragon slaying is attributed to Siamund's son Siegfried, and then contrasted to Hermod, an earlier king of the Danes who descended into tyranny. It is sometimes assumed that the disastrous ending of Hermod's reign is the cause of the Danes' lordlessness and distress mentioned at the beginning of the poem. The implication is that Beowulf's deeds place him in the ranks of other exemplary figures. The method of narration is elusive and indirect, as though the audience were expected to know the details of the story and appreciate an elliptical reference to them. And that is indeed most likely the case. That this story of the hero Siegmund, which we have coming down to us in the German tradition and in the Norse tradition and in the English tradition, would have been known to everyone. And consequently, this story would not have to be fully fleshed out and elaborated because, in theory, everyone would know the hero Siegmund who overcomes the dragon. So again, he's acting here, Siegmund is, as a juxtaposition with Beowulf in his own story, particularly this conflict with the dragon. And there'll be similarities there, but there'll also be points of difference. Similarly, with Hermod, we're seeing in Hermod, again, he is in some ways the dragon of that narrative, right? He is an example of warning as to what kin strife and particularly avarice can do to a reign. So these stories are not simply triumphalist juxtapositions with Beowulf, who's defeated a monster, and here's some more heroic stories. It says something about how they perceive these kind of heroic narratives. The fact that they are juxtaposed with Beowulf, who's just succeeded, even though they're not necessarily the most positive of tales. So again, the story of Siegmund, right? Again, or his Siegfried, his son, is usually who is attributed to, right? But in this tale with Siegmund, his slaying of the dragon is one of the most famous tales in all the ancient North. In terms of northern heroes, right? It's really Siegmund or Siegfried slaying the dragon Fafnir. That's really at the height of this tradition. And where Beowulf is falling in that, how much is he entering into that story as his own monster fights take place is something worth keeping in mind throughout. All right, so if we move on a little bit here, we will see the interesting reference that we're going to get to Siegmund as well. So this is at line 598. He's described as the most famous of exiles, far and wide among all people, protector of warriors for his noble deeds. He had prospered for them. And the reason that this is perhaps worth noting is this description of the hero as an exile, in this case, the most famous of exiles. So this is a theme we're going to see throughout the entire poem, this theme of exile, driven sometimes by dynastic feud, other times by other forces, but some kind of external force separating the hero from his homeland. Right? And it's a very prevalent part of Anglo-Saxon culture generally, probably because it is a tribal culture, right? Or originally was a tribal culture, and one in which feud played a very prominent role. And if you live in a tribal culture where you have feud, it is very easy to find yourself exiled. And it seems that this enters into this idea of in their heroic literature, of the kind of the wandering hero, the hero who is cut off. And we see this even in a sense in Beowulf, who is the son of an exile himself. We don't know the circumstances, but we know that Beowulf's father, Ecgtheow, had to seek refuge with Hrothgar in Denmark, even though he was not a Dane, right? He was a Wildmunding. But nevertheless, there is this idea that exile, the separation of home, which is right, the kind of locus of identity, separates the hero out, and perhaps it makes him more distinct insofar as he is very much a solitary individual character rather than part of a mass. But it also makes it somewhat ambiguous as to exactly where his loyalties lie. And in some ways, you'll maybe see this with Beowulf. It's not always clear exactly where he stands in relation to certain political issues, for instance. But that is definitely worth noting. All right, so we get a description thereafter of Hermod. We don't have too much time to go into that right now. But then let's go on to the speech of Hrothgar. So if we look at that speech, we get a few interesting things happening rhetorically that we can maybe look at. So Hrothgar is addressing Beowulf. At line 942 to 946 or so, he says something that's kind of interesting. He says, "Lo, that woman could say, whosoever has borne such a son into the race of men, if she still lives, that the God of old was good to her in childbearing." Right? So a very elevated kind of praise for Beowulf. Right? mother, whoever she is, should, be worthy of praise for bearing so great a son as you, O Beowulf. But this is kind of an interesting thing for him to say. And it may be a formulaic element of heroic verse, because it appears that Hrothgar knows that Beowulf's mother was the only daughter of King Hrethel of the Yachts, right? He knows Estiau, he seems to know his parentage. So why he is referring to your mother, whoever she is, though he doesn't know that she was the daughter of King Hrethel. Maybe this is simply, again, a kind of formulaic bit of praise. We talked a bit about that in the first video on Beowulf, of how it's related to this oral tradition. It uses sometimes stock phrases. That could be something like that. Or maybe it's just us trying to impose a kind of logical order on a poem which doesn't always fit together like we would maybe want, say, a novel to do. Right. Likewise, we get a little bit of a confusing point also in this speech, or rather in the return to the speech, when Beowulf responds by talking about how he would, this is at line 960, I would much prefer that you could have seen the foe himself, as Grendel, decked in his finery, fallen and exhausted. Right. There's a note there. Professor Leeza says that, right. Literally, the Old English says in his adornments, which is a peculiar phrase since Grendel is notoriously not armed and unadorned. He suggests that perhaps Beowulf means covered in a garment of blood. Another potential way that you could maybe see this would be that it's a reference to maybe his weapon-like claws, which we're going to get a description of in a moment. That those are kind of his weapons, and he wishes he would have had the whole body there with all of its kind of natural weapons in that way. He says right after that with a hard grip I hope to bind him quickly and keenly on the killing floor, so that in my hand grasp he would have to lie squirming for life, unless he might slip away. So he's not expressing here, Beowulf is not expressing a desire for capture of Grendel, but rather that he wishes he could have bound him unto death with his hand, right? So again, an expression of, right, his desire that he not get away, but really be entirely subject to his own strength, and particularly his hand strength, which is one of the defining characteristics of Beowulf. But we see shortly thereafter, this is at about line 968, he says, I could not. The Creator did not wish it. Hinder his going. No matter how hard I held that deadly enemy, too overwhelming was that fiend's flight. So, could we see this as an example of modesty from Beowulf here? We've seen him kind of boasting throughout, and we've talked about how part of that is a cultural thing that's maybe not necessarily supposed to be seen by the reader as a kind of pejorative thing. However, here we do see Beowulf nevertheless indicating, like, I wanted to hold him, but I wasn't able to do it. And now he puts it also within that frame, again, that kind of monotheistic frame perhaps of, right, the Creator did not wish it, but still he seems to be taking responsibility for the fact that he couldn't get away. But then he does follow that up in case perhaps you want to stress too much this statement that could be seen as a modest statement. He says, yet he forfeited his hand, his arm and shoulder to save his life, to guard his tracks, though he got little comfort thereby, pathetic creature. A loathsome destroyer will live no longer, rotten with sin, but pain has seized him, grabbed him tightly in its fierce grip, its baleful bonds, and there he shall abide, guilty of his crimes, the greater judgment, how the shining Maker wishes to sentence him. Right, so basically, Beowulf is making it sound as though it was actually almost like a desperate ploy that he left his arm behind just so Beowulf couldn't get all of them, which maybe makes it sound less like he slipped away and more like right, he needed to escape from the great power of Beowulf's grip. But there's an interesting bit at the end of that I read there where he talks about right, him abiding guilty of his crimes, the greater judgment, how the shining Maker wishes to sentence him. So there's this question of, is this, again, another Christian interjection into the narrative by the author? Or could this actually be seen as compatible with the Germanic hell of the dead? The word hell, now in English has a Christian connotation, is originally an old Germanic word that kind of meant the realm of the dead. And so there's a question perhaps of, is that's a reference just to that idea that, right, he will be kind of sent there, and maybe it's not quite the Christian hell, but of course we've seen this throughout. There's a playing around with these theological concepts that are from the time and the culture of the author, and ones that are from the time and the culture of the characters, which is probably, this is at least centuries before the written version that we have. More controversial as to exactly how far it is from when it was originally composed, but that's somewhat irrelevant here. But we do want to note these kind of references a little bit to just understand culturally what's going on. And similarly, shortly after that, we see this description of the claws of Grendel. This is at 984. It says, at the end of each nail is a sharp tip, most like steel, heathen talons, terrible spikes of that awful warrior. Right. So even the weapons of Grendel, as his talons, are described as heathen. And so there's almost a sense as though every part of the creature is cut off from God. But we've already seen that. He bears God's ire, right? He's the descendant of Cain, the first murderer. He's very much outside of the realm of society in that way. But again, he's still presented very tangibly as a physical creature. So we see at lines 997 to 999 this description that shining building, this Heorot, was nearly shattered inside, entirely fast in its iron bands, its hinges sprung. The roof alone survived unharmed, when that horrible creature, stained with foul deeds, turned in his flight, despairing of life. Right. So there's this sense that Heorot, which is described as, again, the greatest of halls, right? It's been almost shattered by this creature. So great is his power. And also so great is this clash between Beowulf and Grendel, right? We get a sense that even though Beowulf got the best of the creature, that this nevertheless was a tough battle, which almost destroyed the hall itself. And considering that the hall is in many ways representative of civilization, of society in the world of the poem, the fact that it was almost brought down is maybe indicative of what the results of these kinds of conflicts are. And Beowulf follows that up by saying, right, death is not an easy thing to escape, try it who will. But compelled by necessity, all must come to that place set aside for soul bearers, children of men, dwellers on earth, where the body fast on its bed of death sleeps after the feast. So we get this interesting reference that Beowulf, he says that death is not easy to escape. We will see later in the poem that is exactly what Beowulf will encounter. But there's at this point a very clear reference that death is not easy to escape, not just for the hero who goes out to fight the monster like Beowulf, but rather just for the average man in general. So shortly thereafter, we get again a reference to Heorot. This is at about line 1017, where it says, Heorot within was filled with friends. No false treacheries did the people of the Scyldings plot at that time, right? So there's that very important phrase, at that time, indicating what? Well, that at some other time there will be. Now we get a note on this to kind of help us. If we look at Professor Lease's note, he says, implicit in this statement is the idea that at some later time, the people of the Scyldings did plot false treacheries. From other sources, it is possible to infer that after the death of Hrothgar, his nephew, Hrothulf, ruled, rather than Hrethich, Hrothgar's son. Many scholars assume that the story of some sort of treacherous usurpation was known to the audience. This gives a special urgency to much of what happens in these scenes of feasting, especially the speeches of Wealhtheow. So Wealhtheow, the wife of Hrothgar, is really going to want to serve this function that queens are sometimes seen to fill in Anglo-Saxon culture, this idea of peace weaving. The queen would be the peace weaver. They weave peace maybe through marriage alliances, but even just through their kind of counsel in the hall. And what it seems that Wealhtheow wants is Beowulf to protect her son, Hrethich, perhaps against her own nephew, Hrothulf. And so there is this question of where does Beowulf fall in all this? We'll see a little bit later on in the poem that Beowulf is very keenly aware of these kinds of tensions. All right. So let's just go over quickly here the how the narrative at this point unfolds. Right. If we don't know what's going to happen, it appears that at this point, again, the monster has been defeated. The hall is safe. We're getting a series of speeches and stories. Everything is looking great. We don't find out, and it's all very dramatically actually built up until quite late, that there's another creature stalking the moors. And it bursts into the hall, and this is Grendel's mother. There's a somewhat confusing description where it indicates, right, there's this question of her fierceness and terrifyingness was as much less as an Amazon's is to a regular man, and so we don't know, does that mean it's less or more? Where do Amazons rank in that kind of schema? But it seems to be potentially argued that she is the more powerful, more terrifying enemy. So she grabs a Thane, now just one Thane, and that's already in itself somewhat interesting. Why? Because we've talked about this idea of a feud culture, kind of tit for tat, uh, uh, you know, almost like a kind of reciprocity, right? If one man is killed, right, then another man will be killed in revenge. So her son was killed by Beowulf, so she takes one man. Poor Ashra, who we find out is actually a friend and counselor of King Hrothgar, is dragged out of the hall. And it's only at this point that they, it's perhaps somewhat humorous to the modern reader, kind of indicate that, well, we forgot to mention, oh yeah, there were two of them, right, stalking out there. So Beowulf takes his men and sets out on this expedition to find the mother of Grendel. They discover the severed head of Ashra outside of this mere, again, perhaps calling back to what Beowulf indicated, right? This idea of, there not being anything left but the head, or not even that. If he were to lose, or we see that in the case of Ashra, and they come to this it's almost like a haunted mere, right? It's covered or swimming with weird creatures that we don't quite know what they are. There's a sense that this place is beyond the realm of normativity. It's in the land of monsters. We also see, in many ways, Beowulf, again, coming out of this previous section, where we're having a bit of political intrigue. He seems to have more of one foot in the historical realm, is very much going to once again be functioning as the fairy tale character. As he dives into the mare, and it's described as taking days to get down there. Now, maybe that's a matter of translation or hyperbole, or maybe this hero who can fight sea monsters and has the grip of 30 men in his grasp, maybe he is able to actually last that long, and maybe we aren't supposed to think of it being odd that there'd be a mere so deep that it would take days to swim through and that he wouldn't be able to do it. We're probably not really supposed to dwell on these kinds of elements. In any case, he comes into the lair of Grendel's mother, and we have this second confrontation, very different than the first, which is very physical, right? It's a matter of kind of grappling between Beowulf and Grendel, and Beowulf's strength overcomes. Here we see it's a little bit different. For one, we see that Beowulf has been given a sword by Unferth, right? He's been given Hrunting. Now, Hrunting is actually wielded by Beowulf here, so he's not concerned. With Grendel, he was concerned about using swords because Grendel didn't use swords. Here, he's not concerned about that. He's willing to use swords. The sword is ineffective, right? This is the first of these examples. We've seen that swords can work for Beowulf. He apparently used them in battles against sea monsters, but they do not work here. So it's ineffective. We also see the strength and kind of terror of Grendel's mother as she's able to fling Beowulf to the ground and kind of get on top of him. She tends to stab him with a knife, so we see that maybe she's a little bit more intelligent than Grendel, and that she can use weapons. And we also see Beowulf in a very bad way. Again, there's a fair argument to be made that the fight with Grendel's mother is actually more difficult for Beowulf, particularly because he will need outside help, or at least not. Maybe not outside help. He'll at least need, we could call it, instrumental help. So at line 1663, we're going to see that Beowulf's strength ultimately is inefficient to conquer Grendel's mother on its own, but his strength is sufficient to wield the only sword that is capable of destroying she who is magically protected against all the blades. We can assume. We know that there's a sense that these spells were kind of wound around Grendel, and so swords couldn't harm him. And we see the Hrunting, the sword that's given to Beowulf by Unferth, who incidentally we can only assume didn't know it would be ineffective, that you could interpret it as a way of Unferth, unpeace, as his name means, trying to actually sabotage Beowulf, but we need not see it that way. But we see that there is a sword, nevertheless, that's capable of overcoming her, even though Hrunting couldn't do it. So he is, and this is actually 1663 is Beowulf retelling the story. Right, I've jumped ahead a little bit. So he finds this sword, which it's wound in runes in this kind of ancient script, the story of the fall of the giants. And here again, we get a bit of a conflating. In many ways, this element of ancient work of giants is very Germanic, as part of their native culture, but at the same time, it seems to be the story of giants from the Bible, the kind of biblical giants who have, punished with this flood, with the wrath of God, and they made this sword, which makes it seems, have some kind of power and magic to it. So the way that he describes it later when he's retelling the story, and again, this is at 1663. He refers to Hrunting. He says, "I could not achieve anything at that battle with Hrunting, though that weapon is good." So clearly, Beowulf did not see it as a form of sabotage, at least. "But the ruler of men granted to me that I might see on the wall a gigantic old sword, hanging glittering. He has always guided the friendless one, so I drew that weapon." So we get the sense that he draws this giant sword, and he beheads Grendel's mother and wins this second monstrous battle. He then also uses the sword to behead Grendel, whose corpse is lying in the mere. But the blood of Grendel, this kind of acidity, actually melts. Right, it's like ice. The blade melts, and so he's only able to have the hilt. And it's actually the head of Grendel, even though he went there to kill Grendel's mother. It's the head of Grendel that he takes back as a trophy. And it's kind of interesting. He describes right after where I left off there by saying, "In that conflict when I had the chance, I slew the shepherds of that house." So he describes, right, both of the monsters as the shepherds of their own house. So there's that question of like, well, does that make Beowulf a wolf then? We talked about what his name means, Beowulf, wolf of the bee. But there is some people have argued that, well, Grendel's mother is really just avenging her son, and she only takes one man in recompense. And so, maybe there's supposed to be a little bit of sympathy there. But it's maybe worth asking, but it is, of course, also important to note, right, what he's saying after this, right, indicating okay, the battle sword burned up with its ornaments, the blood shot out, hot sweat of battle. I brought the hilt back from the enemy. I avenged the old deeds, the slaughter of the Danes, as seemed only right. Right, so again, he's avenging 12 years of slaughter by Grendel. And it's clear, again, that even through the melting of the sword and the blood, that even though they are creatures of flesh and blood, but they're cursed monsters, right? They are not meant to be seen, it seems, as sympathetic. But again, we also have this cultural blending here in terms of even the way these giants are described. So at lines, say, around 1687, right, we get this description of what is carved on the sword. Ancient strife, when the flood slew rushing seas, a race of giants, they suffered awfully, right? So we get a fusion of the native Germanic mythology of these Eotinas, the Jotuns, right? In Norse, it's Jotunheim, there's frost giants who live there, that kind of thing, right? But it's fused with the giants of the Bible as well. And so we get the narrative of the flood, although it seems possible that the Anglo-Saxons had their own flood narrative as well. So these two cultural currents are coming together. And we see this at a broader level too. So following this, we get what is often referred to as Hrothgar's sermon, because it does seem very sermon-like. Again, it's almost as though he is functioning like one of the patriarchs in the Old Testament. So he's referencing God in a very monotheistic way, but he's also referencing this very native Germanic story of Heremod, who, again, as we mentioned before, he's very much a warning against avarice and kin violence. So, and it's expected that, again, the audience would know these stories. So it seems to be blending both of these kinds of cultural aspects together as it journeys towards its conclusion, which is ultimately the departure of Beowulf from Heorot and his return to Jotland. And this is really how it ends. It says, this is at 1880. It says, Beowulf from thence, that's from Denmark, gold-proud warrior, trod the grassy lawn, exulting in treasure. The sea-goer awaited its lord and owner, where it rode at anchor. As they were going, the gift of Hrothgar was often praised. That king was peerless, blameless in everything until old age took from him, it has injured so many, the joy of his strength. So in one way, you could divide Beowulf into two parts, and if you did, you could see this as the end of the first part. And it really ends, if you want to see it as an ending, with a contrast of youth and old age. The youth of Beowulf, who has overcome these monsters and is setting off laden with treasure back to his king Hrothgar, and Hrothgar will soon be robbed of all his strength. Remember, he himself is already powerless against Grendel and had to rely on a young foreign warrior to help him. But he will soon be robbed of all of his strength, it seems, and that joy. And we also know that lurking behind this, again, is question of will his nephew Hrothulf ultimately steal the throne from his son. We know ultimately the Heorot will burn when Ingeld burns it to the ground. Yeah, in later times, which will not be dealt with in the poem. So there is this lurking element, and we will see as we continue our exploration of Beowulf next time that Beowulf too, in his old age, will be robbed of at least some of the joys of his youth.